hear me? Is it on now?
It's on.
Excellent. Okay, great. Well, welcome back. I'm glad that you came. I'm glad that you brought some friends. That's exciting too. And we're just going to dive right into this. So this is the second of our 5-week Lenten series, and we're looking at the 7 letters of Revelation. So tonight we're going to eventually get into the letter to Ephesus, but first we're going to start with a few other things, one of which is I want you guys at your tables in a second to introduce yourselves to one another. But I also want you to reflect on this passage. I'll go ahead and read it to you. So it says, "The more specifically, the content of the letter relates to the concerns and situation of its addressees. The more other readers have to read it as a letter not to themselves, but to other people. This need not diminish its value to readers other than the addressees. It can speak to them, but only when something of the context of its original addressees becomes part of the way it speaks to them." So I kind of wanted to just start off with you thinking about, can you think of an aha moment when knowing about the context of a passage, knowing about the historical background, just knowing something about it made that passage come alive and you read it in a new way? So I just wanted you to take a few minutes, maybe introduce yourselves, and if you can think of a time when the context mattered, when it made the content come alive, when you realized, oh, this was written to real people with real lives. When was that? Did you have a moment like that in your life? So just take a few minutes and go ahead and talk to one another and see if you can remember a moment like that.
I think it should start since he's here. You're outnumbered,
Well, that's who I am. I'm Dick Sheffield, and I'm very proud of my namesake, Dick Sporting Goods.
Oh, yes. Yes, I will shop there.
I will shop there even if I don't need anything.
You guys heard what they did today? They are not selling rifles to anyone. Go ahead.
Well, they're not selling AR-15s ever again.
Yes.
Or any assault weapons.
Yeah.
And they raised the age to 21 on their own.
Yes, so they will not do that. So I commend them.
And Walmart followed tonight. They had already stopped with the AR-15s with the assault rifles a couple of years ago. They just raised their age to 21.
So your name, you're Dick Walmart.
Railroad tracks go down.
Oh, I wouldn't be sitting here. There's a nice island in the South Seas that I wouldn't be sitting here. So I have to start, huh? I think for me, there have been a number of eye-openers because of what I do for a living and nothing else. I have to come up with creative ways to communicate scripture to congregations, but it kind of blew me away when I finally realized that 1 Corinthians 13, which is the standard of chapter, is the one that gets read at all weddings. So love is patient. All that stuff. The gooey stuff is not gooey at all, because you have to read between the lines. He was writing to these people. If you read what comes before and after, he's really saying love is kind and you people aren't. Love is gentle and you people are not. Love is patient and you are most impatient. You have that context to change the whole meaning. And I now tell people at weddings that if they want to read the whole chapter, at least to try to see the context. Because otherwise it sounds like a Hallmark card. And it's not. It was his impeccably finessed astral way of inserting the blade and twisting. People that read it did not read it as a Hallmark card. That doesn't but that also does not diminish its role as a definer of love. Basically, he's describing the love of God and he's saying that people are right to falling for it. And since you set me up,
I was thinking specifically of the Holy Land that's often mentioned in Scripture. Today I was talking to a friend who's going to the Holy Land on Monday. He's a Catholic, his wife's Methodist, but about 2 months ago we found out that this Irish Catholic by the last name of Murphy is 51% European Jew. So he says now he has renewed interest. And I was telling him how when I came here to the Holy Land, and I didn't listen to sermons for a long time, because every time we would read the 3 scripture passages, there would be something that would be geographic. And I just think about, being there and what it was like and what was happening. And especially, I think what really hit me when I was there was how desert the desert is. There's so many desert passages, but I've never seen deserts like that here. I've seen deserts in the Southwest that were mostly sand, but not those the rocky deserts, the dry places, very desolate, very, at least on sandy deserts you can walk and, with places there that you almost couldn't walk because of big and bigger rocks. So that's something.
My name is Susan, and I don't have any enlightenment on this right now.
Okay. Did you have time to share the stories? Hello? Okay, now it's on again. Great. All right, great. So hopefully you're able to come up with at least a few stories, and remember that context matters, because we're going to talk about context for a little bit. So hopefully you're on my side now, and you're going to be okay with going through a few things first. So a couple things about Revelation before we dive into the first letter. So we spent a lot of time last week talking about what apocalyptic literature is, right? And we had these fun pictures that we drew. I thought I would bring it back again. And I brought Yoda back as a reminder that we all start with the same dots, with the same data, right? But we come with drastically different pictures in the end. So lots of times we have fights over my view is biblical and your view is not. Well, frankly, they're all coming from the Bible. It's the same dots. It's the same data. People are just drawing the pictures very differently. So I think it's always good to start from a position of humility, knowing that these views are all biblical. I could be wrong. It's not my job to assume the rightness of my position. It's my job to look at those dots, to look at the data, to put it in context as best as I can, to try to do the best job that I can to construct that picture. Does that make sense? We all probably inherited some picture of Revelation growing up. I know I grew up Southern Baptist, so I had a very premillennial, if you know what that word means, view of what was going to happen. In fact, I was just reflecting tonight. I'm turning 40 this year. Yes, can you believe it? And I was thinking, you know what? It's kind of amazing. I'm excited about turning 40 because I never thought I would live this long. I really didn't think I would live this long because I was sure Jesus was coming back any day. Because that is how I grew up. I didn't think I would even make it out of high school. I was sure Jesus was coming back because that is the picture I inherited, right? Biblical. I don't think it's the best drawing of the Bible necessarily, premillennialism. We're not going to get into all of that right now. But just starting from a position of humility, saying that, we're all using the same book. Maybe we can have a little bit more love to one another when we disagree about the pictures. And we're going to talk more about love later on because it's going to come up in Ephesians 2. So, Revelation is not just an apocalypse. It is also called a prophecy. So if you guys open your Bibles to Revelation 1, I want you to look at those first 3 verses. And in those first 3 verses, you're going to see that it's already been called revelation. And in Greek, that's the word for apocalypse. And then if you float on down to verse 3, you'll see that it's also called a prophecy. Can everybody find that? Making sure I'm not just making it up here. Yeah? And there's a lot of overlap between prophecy and apocalypse. But one of the things about prophecy is that it's not just about telling the future. That's what a lot of people think, it's just, foretelling, telling what's going to happen. Sometimes it does tell about the future, but more often than not, it's about talking to the present situation. The prophets were never popular, right? You never wanted to be called by God to be a prophet. Jeremiah was never going to get invited to a party, right? He wasn't a party sort of guy. They called him the weeping prophet, right? It's because it was their business to kind of tell everybody what's what. When the king was misbehaving, they're the ones that had to go and speak truth to power, and whoever wants to do that, right? Prophecy was more about this, about critiquing the social, the political, the moral, the economic situation of a country, of a people group. Yes, it talked about the future, but usually it was in the sense of if you don't shape up, if you don't change Israel, then X, Y, or Z is going to happen. Okay? So in many ways, John is a prophet, and he even calls himself a prophet several times throughout the book of Revelation, because he is speaking truth to power. He is saying something about his present day, about that situation, and that's one thing that we kind of have to hold, right? He had something to say to the Roman Empire, and he had something to say to these churches who were living under it, okay? But the third thing, Revelation is also a letter or letters, which is what we're going to start talking about, okay? Letters. And if you wanted to get technical, it's actually a series of letters within a circular letter, but we'll talk about that in a minute, okay? Here are a few other background things for you. So the dating of Revelation, because this matters, people either date it to the reign of Emperor Domitian, and here you can see his dates. Normally they'll say maybe around like 95 CE, which is, the upgraded term for AD. They mean the same thing. Or occasionally it gets dated earlier, and some people think it was during the time of Emperor Nero. Most biblical scholars are going to go with the dating of Domitian, okay? And that's kind of what I'm going to assume for the purposes of this lecture too. Now, who wrote it? Well, the good news is it's not anonymous. We actually have a claim right up front. Somebody named John, we'll call him John the Seer, and he knows the people to whom he's writing. He's familiar with these groups. Here's a picture. I kind of like Christian art, so I think it's always kind of fun to see what people imagine John was like and what it looked like on the Isle of Patmos. So what do we know from the internal evidence of the book itself? Well, we know a few things. We know that he is exiled to the island of Patmos. We can talk more about that in a little bit. We know that he went there. If you look at verse 9, if you want to look back at the text, he went there, says, because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. So that somehow got him into trouble. Now, there are all kinds of legends associated with John. We could spend probably a whole night talking about that. But one of the legends associated with John is that he got in trouble for preaching the gospel and actually got sent to Rome. And there are all these stories about things that happened in the boat on the way to Rome. But basically, the legend is that he goes to Rome in front of Emperor Domitian himself. And the only reason he doesn't get killed is because he is able to drink poison and survive. He is able to do miracles like raise this one girl from the dead. He is able to survive this pot of boiling oil, and there's even a gate if you were to go to Rome that's named after this legend. So because he's able to do all these miracles, Domitian's like, I'll just exile you instead. So he gets exiled to the island of Patmos, and we're told that that's where he has these visions, and that's where he writes these letters back to the mainland, back to these 7 cities, who he did know. He was familiar with those people. We can also tell from the text itself that John was most likely coming from Palestine. Why? I am not a linguist, so I'm just going to trust those who are. But linguists who have analyzed the text themselves tell us that the Greek looks like it was written by a native Aramaic Hebrew speaker, just the syntax and everything of it. So probably somebody from Palestine, we can tell that. Now, we have all these debates in biblical studies because, you got to make a living somehow. So there are all these debates about whether this John, this seer John, this prophet John, is the same John as the Apostle John, one of the 12 apostles, the brother of James. So traditionally, it's been assumed that he is, right? He's the same guy who wrote the Gospel of John, who wrote the 3 letters of John, and who wrote this book, Revelation, in the Bible. So 5 books attributed to this guy. There's some debate about it. I'm not going to get into all of that, but just to let you know that there is some. What's really interesting is that, fun facts for you, the Gospel of John, there actually is no claimed authorship. It's anonymous. Have you ever noticed that before? We're told that it's written by someone who is the beloved disciple. We don't actually ever get a name for him in the Gospel of John itself. If you look at the letters of John, we're told that they are written by the elder, and so sometimes John is also called the elder as well. Revelation, you get a claim for a guy named John. Whether it's the same John or not, we're not told in the book itself, but that is what Christian tradition has handed on to us. Okay? So those are some of the things that we know or that we don't know about this author. Some of the other traditions, just in case you want to know, they say that John lived until he was 120 years old, that he died in 100 AD. So whether that's true or not, I can't tell you. I can't jump in a time machine to assure everything, but that is one of the traditions about John. So he would have been really, really old if it's the same Apostle John who's writing this. In fact, according to tradition, after being exiled on the island of Patmos, they say that Domitian dies, and so once he dies, like, his sentence is commuted, and so he's able to go back to the mainland, and so he goes and rejoins the church in Ephesus, and that supposedly is where he dies. If you were to go to Ephesus, you could visit his grave today. This is a picture of the Church of St. John that's in Ephesus. Other legends that we're told about, some church history. It's hard to kind of figure that out, the line between history and legend sometimes. But we're told that Mary, the mother of Jesus, John kind of adopted her as his own mother after the death of Jesus, and that he took her with him to Ephesus. And so there's even a house, that's the house of Mary, that you can go and visit, where she supposedly died in Ephesus as well. So there are tons of early Christians that are running around in this city. It's quite important, okay? Some other things. So who is he writing it to, and where is he writing it from? Well, I already told you where he's writing it from, and that's just a fancy term for saying that's where he was. He was on the island of Patmos, which is just about 50 miles south off the coast of Ephesus, and it's a really rocky island, beautiful if you ever get the chance to go, but it was a penal colony. So it would make sense if he was actually exiled there, because that's where they would send people. The recipients who's getting this letter or letters within a letter, we're told that it's 7 churches that are over in Asia Minor. And I wanted to clarify something about that because it gets a little confusing. So maps help me. Hopefully they help you too. So you've probably heard the terms Asia, Asia Minor, Anatolia, all these things. Like, what is that and what do they refer to? Well, here's where it gets confusing. Okay, ready? We all know there's a continent of Asia, right? And most of what is today Turkey, this landmass right here, is part of Asia. So it belongs to the continent of Asia. But now this landmass right here is known as Asia Minor. Okay, this bit right here. Also, Anatolia. Anatolia, Asia Minor, same thing, just 2 different names for it. And Anatolia means east because they would always see the sun rising from the east, at least the Greeks who were over there and who gave it this Greek name of Anatolia. So you also hear the term Asia, the region of. Now that's a Roman designation. See how Rome divided the different areas? So Asia is the Roman area in which the 7 cities are. So they lived on the continent of Asia, on Asia Minor, in the region of Asia. Is that confusing enough for you guys? Okay, all right. So just in case that gets confusing, so you know what those things are. And here they are, so you can see them more up close. Now, have you ever wondered why these 7 cities, and maybe even why only 7? What are your guesses? Anybody have any good guesses? Why these 7? Why only 7? Have you ever wondered that before? Yeah?
Are they on a common road or?
She is really smart. That's usually what scholars will say, because if you were taking the boat from Patmos, you would go over to Ephesus. Even today, Kushadasi is right there. That's a town, and that's where you take a little ferry. So you would get to Ephesus, and then it would be on kind of a postal route, for lack of a better term. So you would go north to Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. So they usually say that's the order. Why those 7, and why only 7? Any other guesses? Yeah.
7 is kind of a holy number. You see,
Absolutely. We see it a lot. Do you know what it means?
it's a perfect number.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a number of perfection, the number of completion. So some people believe he chose 7 and only 7 to kind of represent the entire church, the perfect, complete church of Jesus. So they're representative for kind of like all the churches, if that makes sense. Yeah, so those are a couple of reasons why maybe 7, but why those particular 7? We don't really know. The best guess is that maybe these are just ones that he's more familiar with because he knew them, right? They're people that he knows. I don't know why he didn't pick Colossae over Laodicea. Great question. Maybe, again, this number of 7 kind of limited him, and he just wanted to get some different ones in different geographical areas, so he picked some of the more prominent cities. So, I don't know. We could speculate about that for a while. Now, moving on. I told you it was a circular letter, and you're probably like, what is she talking about? Circular letter. Well, you just saw that map, how a postal worker, let's call them that, would kind of go in a big circular route to deliver this message. So they take it from church to church to church. That's what I mean by a secular letter. And this is not the only one in the Bible. In fact, if you were to go and open your Bibles, which you can, go to 1 Peter, then you're told that 1 Peter was actually written to 5 different regions, just in case you want to see. It's written to these 5 different regions, to Asia, to Bithynia, to Pontus, to Cappadocia, beautiful if you ever get to go there, and to Galatia. So it was meant to go across a big, huge area of churches. So we're told that in 1 Peter. Now, Ephesus, or I should have put the letter to the Ephesians, that's a typo there, sorry about that. The letter to the Ephesians, people think that that also is a circular letter for a variety of different reasons. I won't go into all of it, but basically it's possible that Paul wrote this letter at the same time that he was writing Colossians because they overlap in material, like 1/2 to 1/3 of the material is similar between Colossians and Ephesians. Also, it's a very general letter because usually circular letters are general because they have to fit a wider audience, right? So you don't talk about specific people or specific things quite as much. So it's not tailored to a specific church, much more general theology in some ways in that book. And some of the earliest documents that we have, copies of Ephesians, don't have the title on it. In fact, we even have one church father who said it was the letter to the Laodiceans. And we do know that Paul wrote a letter to the Laodiceans because at the end of Colossians we're told, hey, send your letter over to Laodicea and to Hierapolis and you read the stuff that I wrote to them. So basically swap the letters sort of thing going on. So it's possible. Some people think that almost in some ways Ephesians is more like a circular letter than it is a letter to a particular community. It looks very different than a letter like the one to the Philippians or to the Thessalonians, for instance. So there are other instances of this happening, writing to a general group of people. What's unique about John, though, is that within this general body of work, the whole book of Revelation, he's also put 7 very specific, very unique letters to these 7 different churches. So kind of 7 letters within one big circular letter that's being sent to all of them. Does that make sense? I'll pause here for a second. Did you have a question?
I'm just trying to understand when you say the term church.
Mm-hmm.
For us, there's a church building.
Yeah.
There's a denominational church.
Mm-hmm.
How was that constructed?
That's a great question. So originally they would have mainly been house churches. So people would have met in houses. Well, they could have met anywhere. If you were to go and visit Ephesus today, you could walk up, pretty much walking up a cliff to this cave that looked like a shepherd's cave. And you'll find some drawings that are of St. Paul and St. Thecla and some other saints up there. And it looks like it was a cave where early Christians worshipped. Some Christians in Rome were worshiping in catacombs. So basically, wherever you could, but more often than not, it would be in houses. Sometimes it would be in a synagogue because originally, of course, the believers, the followers of Jesus, are Jewish, right? So they would have still been in the synagogue. They didn't stop going to the synagogue when they started following Jesus because he's the Jewish Messiah, right? This is just the fulfillment of everything they've been waiting for. So around 70 to 80 AD CE, there was a parting of ways between Judaism and Christianity. So at that point, they would have been kicked out of the synagogue. Definitely couldn't have met there anymore, but usually just in people's houses. So, group of believers. Does that make sense? No. Okay. Any other questions so far? No? I can talk all night. All right. So you can stop me when you want. All right. So at the beginning of each of these 7 letters, we do get an introduction. And if you were to go back and look at chapter 1, verses 4 through 5, it very much looks like the introduction to a typical letter, almost like Paul, because you even get the standard grace and peace. That's a very Christian introduction to letters. But then we get other introductions to letters within this letter, right? So if you want to look for them yourself, I'll put them up there. What's really interesting is that each of these churches is facing different struggles, unique challenges. But at the same time, they all have a few challenges that they share just because they live under the Roman Empire. But we can see that some of these churches were responding very differently to that situation. So it's interesting because he takes the time to tailor it to each different community and what he's heard about them and what he's seen in them. So another thing that's interesting about the 7 letters is that they also work as introductions for the whole book of Revelation, because a lot of the themes that come up in these first 7 letters show up again and again and again throughout the whole book. So they help to introduce us to what's coming next. But if I had to say what the main theme was in all of these letters, this is one thing that keeps coming up. It's that they've got to resist compromising their faith, even though they're being oppressed, even though they live under this oppressive regime of the Roman Empire. Okay? So they have to resist it. Now, what was it like to live under the Roman Empire if you're a minority religion? I don't know, have you guys ever wondered that or thought what that might be like? We don't really have that experience in America because Christianity is still the predominant religion, right? But what would it be like to be a minority believer of a different faith? Well, religion under Rome, we talked about this some last week. So Rome was basically cool with whatever to some extent. They would take over a new region and they would accept those gods. They'd even put some of them over in Rome, in some of their own temples. You believe in this god, that god, great, we'll just add them to the mix because we believe in lots of gods, no problem. And this was actually pretty common in the ancient world. So for example, in Ephesus, we know that there were Greek settlers who came over there, 11th to 10th century BCE, and that there were already foundations of some kind of worship center to this Anatolian mother goddess. So there's already some mother goddess that's being worshipped. The Greeks see that and they're like, cool, we'll just call her Artemis, right? Because we already got a mother goddess, must be same, cool, we're good. And so they just kind of adopted that. That's what Rome would do too. Oh, you've got an Artemis, well, we got somebody called Diana, cool, same, right? So they're fine with other religions to a certain extent, as long as they're innocuous, right? As long as they don't cause any problems, as long as they don't have a lot of crazy prophets, critiquing the overall system, it's fine. They just don't want people messing up the status quo. Just keep sending the taxes into Rome, right? So we don't like it when there's social unrest. We don't like thieves and traitors and insurrectionists and, prophets. We don't like them. Now, Judaism actually had been accepted as kind of an official religion. And so originally Christianity, as I said, was looked at as part of Judaism. It's just kind of a sect within Judaism. So they're kind of grandfathered in. So they're still allowed to practice. There's not actually a lot of persecution going on in the first century. I know lots of times we think, oh, the poor Christian martyrs, and they must have been persecuted all the time. Well, actually, Christianity wasn't outlawed till I think it was 112 was when it was actually outlawed. Now, there were some instances of persecution that were unique to certain places. Rome, Nero's a great example. You probably heard the story about Nero playing the fiddle while Rome burns down, right? You've heard about that. Well, after that, somebody's got to be blamed, right? So, Christians, yay! So he rounds up a lot of Christians. There are even stories about him setting them on fire as torches to light the path, to his garden parties. So yeah, it's true. There were some Christians who were thrown into the arena. There were some Christians who were burned alive. A lot of things did happen, but it was usually at a particular time, a particular situation. Some of that happened under Domitian too. There was some physical persecution, but more often than not, it was more just social ostracism, right? I mean, think about today. Think if you have a friend who belongs to a minority religion, do they ever feel socially ostracized in a predominantly Christian environment? What is that like? Because they're different, right? So they would have experienced that. One of the reasons they would have experienced that is because of this. You see, we've got some of the emperors up there. This is that big statue I showed you of Domitian last week, big, huge one. And of course, we've got Augustus as well. Because they worshipped the emperors as gods, participate, right? So that's one of the big problems, because if you're a Christian or if you're a Jew, you don't believe in many different gods, right? But you definitely don't believe that the emperor himself is a god. That's really problematic. And it's all over the place. You can't get away from it. So by this point, 1st century AD, all of these towns that we're talking about, all of these cities would have had imperial temples like this one. I showed you this last week too. So this is, if you ever go up to Pergamum, which you definitely should do too, because it's amazing, you'll see that the top of the Acropolis, it's dominated by this building. You see the white building up there? It's a temple to Trajan up there. So they were worshipped as gods. Sacrifices were made to them. Just, you hear about sacrifices in the Old Testament in the temple in Israel to Yahweh. They're making sacrifices to the Caesars as well. So you see that all over the place. So what are you going to do? Here's an example for you. I think you may have heard, I mentioned before that I taught at Messiah, and Messiah is an Anabaptist school. And as you may know, Anabaptists, they don't usually like to say the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Because they believe we don't pledge allegiance to a president or to a country or to anybody that's not God. Our true allegiance is given to God. So you'll see the Anabaptist students, maybe they don't stand up and they're saying the Pledge of Allegiance at school, right? I was at a Rotary Club meeting last night, and they always do the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of the Rotary Club meeting, which made me very uncomfortable, because that's the Anabaptism coming out of me, because I don't know how I feel about saying a pledge to anybody that's not God. But I felt all the social pressure to do it because I'm at the front and people are looking at me. And that's just, I'm not worried about losing a job because of it. Maybe some friends are being excluded, but I mean, they're worried about their livelihood. So for example, you're a silversmith. Okay, we're going to talk about one in a little bit. And you belong to a group of silversmiths. They had those back in those days too. Okay, so your group of silversmiths is getting together, and you're going to the temple, and you are going to burn some incense to Caesar, because that's what you do as a group. What happens when you can't go along? Are you going to get blackballed? Are you not going to be given any jobs anymore? Because they basically had the ancient equivalent of unions, if that makes sense. So now you may not be able to work. You may not be able to feed your family. It could be a matter of life and death without there being some actual physical persecution. Does that make sense? So this is more what they're facing. And I brought this quote for you. Love Richard Bauckham. I'll probably bring in his book at some point. So that is one I would definitely suggest if you're trying to wrap your head around Revelation. So here's what he had to say. The messages show that John addresses a variety of situations which he perceives as very different. By no means all of his readers were poor and persecuted by an oppressive system. Many were affluent and compromising with the oppressive system. The latter offered no consolation and encouragement, but severe warnings and calls to repent. For these Christians, the judgments, which are so vividly described in the rest of the book, should appear not as judgments on their enemies, so much as judgments they themselves were in danger of incurring, since worshiping the beast was not something only their pagan neighbors did. Okay? So, I think in many ways realizing that, now Revelation can mean a lot more to us, because that's more our situation. Like, are we compromising with a structure that is oppressing other people? You know, are we in some sense worshiping the beast of some oppressive system? You know what I mean? So we may not know what it's like to be physically persecuted, but not all these Christians were either. It's a temptation to compromise with something that's ungodly. I guess that's the best way I could put it. So now, when we come specifically to the letter of Ephesus, and that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of our time together. Told you, background's important, right? So I like maps, I like pictures. Here is Ephesus, which is basically the capital of Western Turkey, that Asia region that you saw there. It's great. It's in a great location. If you look on the western coast right there by the Aegean Sea, it's right in the middle. It's got this really awesome harbor where the boats could come in, so they're getting a lot of trade and traffic. Sadly, this is what it looks like today, so you'll notice not so great because there's been a problem of silting from the Casta River that we went to, that would flow into the Aegean Sea there, silting. So after a while, they even had problems with this in antiquity, and they would have to dredge the harbor so that the boats could still get in. Eventually, they had to give up and abandon the site, and so now Ephesus is about 3 miles from the coast, just because of silting over the years. But this used to be the harbor, and it was pretty great. So people were always coming into Ephesus from all over the empire. This is what the harbor road looks like if you were to go there. And kind of more closer up, I like this because you see all of these different columns here. They probably, most likely, had big, huge statues. So you would have been surrounded by these statues as you walked into this amazing and beautiful city, rather than, of course, the bird's nests that are there today. And in fact, one of the fun things that I brought is this book, if you want to pass it around. I love these things because what they do is, yes, they will give you a picture of what it looks like today, but they'll overlay it with what it would have looked like back then. And there's one in here at the harbor if you want to see what it would look like walking down the harbor road and seeing the statues. So I'll let you guys pass that around and you can see what it would have looked like back then. I just have the pictures of today for you. So it would have been really impressive. People are coming because they're on boats and they're coming to the harbor, but they're also walking there because, as I mentioned last week, there's this big, huge road that the Persians built. And guess where it ends? In Ephesus. Like, that's the end point of the whole road. So they're connected all the way across Anatolia. And as I told you before, there are Christian groups that pop up all along this road because, hey, it's easier to travel, right? So they're going to get a lot of trade, a lot of industries coming, both from land and from sea. So much so that actually this was the wealthiest city in that area of the world at that time. Okay, so it's kind of the financial capital, if you will, of Western Anatolia. This is what the city looks like today, and it's kind of, here's where the harbor would be if you really want to know. And so you've got Harbor Road leading in, you've got, this is another main road, I'll show you in a minute. Here's another main road, and there's just buildings all around it, and of course this theater dominates the scene. I'll show you that in a minute too. So this is that road that runs in front of the theater, and it actually goes all the way out to a stadium. It's called Marble Street if you really want to know, but what I wanted you to see more was right here. This is called the Agora. It's the marketplace of, every city had one, and so they did lots of trade. There's a lot of business going on there, but something else that brought business to Ephesus has to do with this street. So this street is the Curatus. I'm not pronouncing that correctly, so don't quote me on that. The Curatus Street. You've heard of the word curate before, which means what?
To care?
Huh?
To care for something?
Yes, but who's it talking about?
Curator?
Curator, or have you ever heard it used for priest as well? Uh-huh. Yeah. Maybe that's just in...
Curia.
Yeah, maybe that's just in my tradition. But anyway, so it is the road that they would come into Ephesus from the temple of Artemis. And that's one of the big reasons that people would make a pilgrimage over to Ephesus, was because of this lady. And I brought a little statue there, if you want to pass that around, a little miniature statue of Artemis. So great is Artemis of Ephesus. Like, she's a specific type of Artemis. This is our Artemis, the Artemis of Ephesus. People come to visit the statues of her. They come to visit her temple. They come to offer sacrifices. Oh, and by the way, I told you before, this has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, because there was already a site devoted to this Anatolian mother god that they just co-opted and built a temple to Artemis. Okay? That first temple that we know about actually was destroyed, crazy guy fire thing, and it actually happened on the day that Alexander the Great was born. And so they said, oh, it must be because Artemis was so busy looking after Alexander's birth that she didn't pay attention to her temple, and that's why she burned, is one of the explanations given. So when Alexander the Great actually conquers the city, I'll show you that in a second. Here's actually a coin. So they had, again, remember we were talking about those signs and symbols last week? You carry them around in your pocket. You can't get away from them. So when Alexander the Great, here he is again with his feast, when he came and conquered the city, they welcomed him as a conquering hero, banquets, all this stuff in his honor. Alexander the Great offers to rebuild their temple for them, and they turn him down. They turn him down because they said, oh no, one God can't build and devote a temple to another God. Remember I told you it starts back with Alexander the Great. They considered him a god, right? So here is the temple that gets rebuilt by them, not by Alexander the Great, and this temple becomes one of the 7 wonders of the world. Yeah, you can impress your friends at some point. Now you know what one of the 7 wonders is. So yeah. So people would come from all over to visit this temple. Sadly, this is all that's left of it today, so this is what it looks like if you were to go there now, unfortunately. It's not nearly as impressive as, say, oh, this theater of Ephesus. Impressive, right? Yeah? They could hold 25,000 people in this theater. Supposedly, Ephesus had about 150,000 people living in it. It was a big city. It's like, I think, number 3 or 4 in the Roman Empire at that point. It's a big deal. And when you're walking in from the harbor, this is the first thing you would see. In fact, this is probably the first thing that Paul ever saw because, friends, Paul was in Ephesus, okay? All this is background. We'll get to it in a minute. He stopped off here on his second missionary journey very, very briefly. He pops in, hi, and then he leaves and he goes back over here. Then on his third missionary journey, after he walks all the way across Anatolia, which, by the way, is 6 times the size of Pennsylvania, just for some perspective for you. He stops and he stays in Ephesus, and he stays there for about 2 to 3 years. So he knew this city pretty well. Now, there's this whole drama that takes place in Acts that is recorded in these verses. Okay? You can look them up if you want, but I'll just briefly remind you of it. So basically what happened was Paul's doing such a good job preaching, people are converting. It's hurting trade because, again, I told you, one of the main reasons that people come to Ephesus is to worship Artemis of Ephesus, the great Artemis. And when they came, just like you come today, you got people outside that are hawking these statues, except back then it was just a little miniature of the temple, which they don't have today, but I've even got in my pocket, this is jewelry that you can get, a little miniature Artemis, so you can see that as well. Yeah. So they would buy things as kind of a little, memory, a little souvenir from going to visit the temple. And so silversmith named Demetrius, told you silversmith was going to come up again, he's not so happy about his business going down. He's pretty riled up. And so he gets a whole band of people together and they want to talk to Paul because they're mad about this. And Paul's friends say, no, Paul, don't go talk to them. They all rush into this theater. They're all really angry. It's a whole riot that's about to break out. It's a whole big deal. But my main point is that Christianity threatens the economy and it threatened the political system. It's not just about you believe what you believe, I believe what I believe. It affects a lot of different things. So just so you have an idea, Artemis was important. These temples were really, really important. And it's interesting because when Paul later on writes a letter back to the Ephesians, he mentions a lot of different things. But I thought this was a pretty good summary since we didn't really have time to talk about everything in that letter. So here's a summary of his letter to him. The emphasis of this letter is on the universal significance of what God has done in Jesus Christ. And universal is meant here in a literal sense. The focus is on what Christ means, not simply for Christians or even for all humanity, but rather for everything in heaven and on earth. Because what is hammered home over and over again is that Christ rules the universe, not Caesar, right? Christ is the one who's brought peace, not Caesar. Yeah? So this is one of the big themes that you get in the letter to the Ephesians, because that place was dominated not just by the temple of Artemis, not just by the worship of her, but by the imperial cult. Getting back to that again. There are lots of different temples to all of these different Caesars. So, I told you last week that in Anatolia, they actually started doing this worship themselves. It wasn't something that was imposed by the Caesars saying, worship me. The Caesars, they weren't too fussed about it. Some of them were. Caligula, Domitian, they were a little bit more fussed, but most of them were like, oh, this is great, sure, I'll take your acclaim, wonderful, lovely. So once they started their own cult of Augustus, that's when the guy comes to visit them in Ephesus, and we know he comes to visit them. They're the ones that decide to build all these temples. And here's a list of some of the Caesars they built temples to. Claudius, Nero, Domitian, Hadrian, Severus, okay? Maybe more. Those are the ones we found. And it's only been like 10 to 20%, I forget the exact figure, of Ephesus that's been excavated at this point, by the way. Huge site, so much more under there, right, that we haven't even gotten to. So they're the ones who are building these amazing grand temples where they're worshiping the emperors, right? And they have incentive to do it. They're not forced to do it, but they have incentive to do it because you remember I told you last week about this whole thing called a neokoros. You get this title if you build a temple. You're called, literally, it's the temple sweeper, but temple keeper as well. Your city is a neokoros, so you have this civic pride. You have a city. And remember I showed you this last week? This is actually in Smyrna, who is a big competitor with Ephesus. They got a nice, healthy rivalry going on. And on this little inscription, it says, we were 3 times neokoros. Ephesus was only at twice, but hey, they only got the title twice. So, the more temples you have, the more civic pride you have, and they start to have festivals, where people will come. There'll be gladiatorial events, there'll be banquets, there's all kinds of festivities that go on, which also, again, brings money to the city, because people come to it, right? All these things are interrelated. It is. That's exactly right. That's exactly what it would be like a football game, but with worshiping the emperor too. So there you go. Now, Domitian, this guy, can you tell what's on his forehead? It's a cross. Because a lot of statues, sometimes they get rid of them, but lots of times Christians would come and they would make their mark on them. So they kind of Christianize them. They would use a lot of the temples as churches later on. They kind of reuse what's already there. They don't just destroy it, they reuse it. But they have a lot of problems with the guy who tells them, you've got to call me Master and God, because that's a title that's reserved for God, for Jesus. They can't do that, right? And the biggest, most important temple there, the cult, is the cult of Domitian, who is the emperor at this time when the letter is being written. Now you're like, where's the temple? It doesn't look so big. Yeah, sadly it's gone. But this is the base of it. So you can see if you're an architect or an engineer, maybe you have some idea of how big this temple would be to have this kind of, undercroft basin to put it on top. Here's kind of another view from the side. You can kind of see how they would walk up the steps here to get up to the temple, kind of giving you more of an idea of what it would look like. This is the fountain of Domitian. I mean, it's this whole plaza in front of the place, right? And he's got fountains, so does Trajan. He didn't get a temple. I don't know why. Maybe we just haven't found it. But we do have this lovely fountain of his. And I showed you this picture last week, too. I don't know if you remember it. But this is him. This is all we've got left of the statue, but it's his foot on top of the world. I'm in charge of the world, right? I rule the world, not anybody else. Something else that is interesting in this is a little inscription that was on top of this fountain area here. So if I zoom in, there we go. Then you can kind of tell, maybe, possibly, that it says autocrator, okay? Autocrator. You've heard of what does it sound like? Yes, very good. What does that mean?
Dictator, a ruler.
Dictator or ruler. Literally, in the Greek, it means self-ruler, because the only person that gets to rule themselves, because we all have bosses, right, is the emperor. This is actually just the Greek version of the Latin emperor, okay? Now, Christians, remember I told you, they kind of come and make their mark on things. They don't always just do away with it. They even do that with titles and names, because Jesus isn't called the autocrator. He's called the pantocrator, the ruler of panto, all, everything, okay? And that's a direct challenge to this title, right? If you go into a lot of old churches, you'll see the kind of central dome area. Lots of times there's a picture of Jesus kind of in heaven, And that's the Pantocrator sort of picture of Jesus, if you ever see that. Now, our friend John goes to Ephesus as well, and I've already told you a bit about that. And I've already told you that, traditionally we believe that John wrote 5 different letters, books, things back to Ephesus. And here they are, okay? Now, what do we learn from these other books? Like, what's the background of what's going on in Ephesus that we can tell from some of these other things? Well, the gospel doesn't help that much, but the letters do. Because in the letters, we find that they're having some kind of conflict between all the house churches. So the Johannine community there is split. You can use the fancy word schism and impress all of your different friends. And there's really strong language in those Johannine epistles. I mean, he calls them deceivers and liars and false prophets and antichrist. Fun fact for you, the only place that this word is used is in the Johannine epistles and not in Revelation, does not appear in Revelation, and in the Johannine epistles it's plural, not just one, antichrist. Interesting, right? This is like mind-blowing for me the first time I heard it. So he's pretty upset about what's going on, and what we can reconstruct is there are a couple different people, like John the Elder, Gaius, Diotrephes, I don't even know if I'm saying that correctly. They're all leaders of neighboring communities, and there's some kind of conflict that's playing out over the issue of hospitality. They're not getting along, they're not receiving one another's kind of messengers, wandering itinerant pastors that they're sending from one community to another. There's a lack of love, and the best way to put it. And so if you had to summarize these letters, like the 2 biggest things you find in the letters are Christology. They're trying to sort out like who Jesus is. And love, ethics, how we treat one another, because there's a lack of love between these different communities. Jay McDermott, he's a former colleague of mine who wrote an amazing commentary on the Johannine epistles. He says, in John's mind, theology, Christology, ethics, mainly love, are inextricably intertwined, because one of the problems they're having is some people believe Jesus didn't come in the flesh, like he wasn't a real human being, and he's trying to, straighten everybody out on that. Because if Jesus wasn't incarnated, if Jesus wasn't fully human, then we're not fully redeemed. And, if the incarnation wasn't important, then does it matter how we treat one another in the flesh? It kind of is a domino effect going from your belief in Jesus, what you think about the incarnation, to how you treat other human beings, other flesh. Does that make sense? Kind of. So anyway, the letter to Ephesus. You're like, yeah, when is she finally going to get to it? I'm trying here, folks. So what you're going to see in all the letters is that first, you're going to have a recipient, right? It's going to be written, and this is the form, to the angel of the church in blank write. Okay? Then you're going to have some descriptive statement about Christ. These are the words of, and it's going to be a description of Jesus. And what I mean by that is, if you go back, and we're not going to analyze this now, we'll kind of look at it as we go through the letters. In the first chapter, there's a vision of the glorified Jesus. Here's some fun Christian art of what this vision looks like. Isn't this one nice? I always like the sword coming out of his mouth. Here's another one as well. Okay, so all different kinds of images. And in it, he's described, there are a number of different aspects that are described. All of these things here. And here's a fun little chart that will tell you, if you really want to know, each one of these aspects is connected with something in the Old Testament. Remember I told you Revelation reuses a lot of Old Testament imagery. So all of these symbols mean something. They all have an importance to them. We're going to talk about some of them as we go through the letters, but the one tonight that I wanted to show you briefly is the one about the 7 stars, because you'll notice it's the only one down here that doesn't actually have a reference to the Old Testament. Interesting, right? And it's the one that's about to get used in this letter. Now, when you get to the body of the letter, it's going to follow this pattern. So we'll see this in the next 3 weeks. You're going to get some compliments about what they're doing right, and you're going to get some complaints usually. And usually it starts with, I know X, Y, or Z about you. Maybe it's wrong to say this, but it always kind of reminds me of Santa Claus. I know if you've been naughty, I know if you've been nice, I know these things about you, right? So he tells them. And then there's some warnings or promises. Again, he's a prophet. here's what's going to happen if you don't shape up, if you don't change. Then you're going to get a conclusion. You're going to get an exhortation, like, if you hear, if you're listening at all, come on, folks, do this. And then there's a promise of usually some type of reward at the end. So that's kind of the structure of all the different letters that you're going to see. And yeah, just for the sake of time, because we're about to run out of it, I hate to not actually get into the letter of Ephesus, but we could pick it up and start with that next week, the very first thing. Is that okay? Okay. Yeah, so we'll wait. And what I kind of want you guys to do is you have that chart. Well, not chart, it's a handout. So you have homework. What I want you to do, and we were going to do it in a group together, but I'm going to let you take it home for homework, is I want you to read Revelation 2:1-7, and I want you to fill it out. Fill in this pattern. What does it say there? And then I want you to think about these questions. Based on the letter, what do you think they were like in Ephesus? What's going on in the church? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are some of the biggest challenges that they're facing? And we're going to start with the letter of Ephesus. If you also have time, you could go ahead and read the letter to Smyrna, which comes next, because we'll definitely do that next week. Not sure if we'll make it to another one, but we'll definitely do that one next week. And so I'm just going to have to leave you hanging on the 7 stars and what it means and everything. But it's always good to end on a cliffhanger because maybe you'll come back, right? I've got to know what it means. I've got to know. So we have a few minutes for questions. I know you guys have to get out of here, but yeah.
You just mentioned something that turned on a light bulb for me, and I've been looking at this for 40 years. Do you think the fact that 1st and 2nd John are the only places where Antichrist is used, that word, the terminology, the connection between the Johannine letters and the book of Revelation, possibly in terms of authorship, is the reason everybody insists the Antichrist is actually found in Revelation?
I think definitely. Yeah, I think that's why they're connected, because it's the same author, right? So yeah, we just assume that it's in Revelation. And in some ways, we assume that it's talking about one of those many beasts that show up, you know, from the serpent to the land beast to the beast from the water. But yeah, there are a number of them. There's not just one, right?
The thing that bothers me most is that in both cases, the Antichrist is actually in the pew.
Absolutely, it's in the plural.
Within us, it isn't somebody outside.
Yeah, he's talking about people who are anti-Christ, against
Within the
Christ.
church.
Yep, so there can be more than one. It's not just this one almost magical figure that you're waiting to find. Again, same data, but we got to look at it and try to figure it out as best as we can with all the clues and the context that we have. So, yeah. Yeah.
The sequence of the letters seems to be sophisticated.
It is.
Where did it come from? Where did that background of understanding
Where did John's background and understanding come from?
come? Yeah, that they were able to produce something at this level.
I don't know. I guess studying a lot of the New Testament letters, I'm not all that surprised, because the more and more you get into them, they're highly sophisticated. I mean, they've got, you know, people who do rhetorical studies will tell us there are things, this is a fancy term, called chiasms, where it's almost like poetry. So they have like A, B, C, D structure, and then it goes backwards, D, C, B, A, like all this stuff that you read it the first time, you're like, I didn't see that. But they took the time to construct it and put it in there because actually rhetoric was quite important in the ancient world. So, I mean, I think they would have had some training in it at some point or picked it up along the way. I don't know necessarily about John's background specifically, but it's not all that uncommon. Yeah. No? Any other questions? No? Okay. Pastor Russell, would you like to say anything?
Thank you so much.
Okay.
It's a wonderful evening and very informative. We can't wait to hear the rest.
Okay.
I do have a question. I've always wondered this.
Yeah.
Why don't they just write letters more directly like they do in the 21st century? Why don't they just write a letter that says, "Dear churches, the Romans are terrible people, don't follow them. Be strong in your faith because they're oppressing you." They don't. Instead,
Because you'd be in prison with
well,
John.
that's disputed whether that it's a code language,
Yeah.
and so apocalyptic is used. But
Yeah. Well, the code's not that hard to break.
Not that hard to break.
Yeah.
So why aren't they more direct? Why are even the Gospels written in a way to reflect a later context, but under the guise?
Story about this little girl, moral of it, right? These fantastical monsters and everything else, it leaves an impression. You know,
Nice.
sometimes I would say an apocalyptic picture is worth 1,000 theological words. You tend to remember it. Stories, images, songs, these things stick with you. And yes, it's a little bit harder to decipher, but you tend to remember it more than something more straightforward. That's one reason. I mean, yeah, maybe they do have plausible deniability of, oh, I didn't really mean that was a Caesar. You know, I said it was a beast, you know. Possible, but I think there are lots of different reasons for it. That's one I would give you.
That's a good one.
Yeah, Jesus taught in parables and stories. You remember stories, you remember images more. So.
Russell, we preachers do not like to believe that that is the case, that they don't remember all of our prayers.
Yeah. Well, I like to hide my meanings sometimes.
Yes.
You gotta make them work for it. You gotta make them do it, right? Okay, well, thank you very much
Thank you.
for having me. I appreciate it.